Thank you. I appreciate everybody being here. This is a daunting crowd to speak to. Very many skilled photographers in this club, and I see a good many of them in the audience tonight. Can we? Yeah, there we go. This is good because now you can see the screen, but you don't have to look at me. Okay, so I'm going to talk about black and white photography. I should start by saying that this photo is Blackwater Falls in West Virginia, and we were talking about competitions earlier. Well, in a local competition, this lost. The judge didn't think it was good enough, and yet it won in F3C. So the moral story is, if you enter something in competition and you believe in it, and you don't like what the judge said, enter it in another competition. Different judge, different day, you may win. Okay. So we're going to talk about, first of all, the kind of unnatural state of black and white photography, given that our eyes see in color. We don't see the world in shades of gray. And our cameras record in color. Back in the days when we shot on film, and for those of you who continue to shoot on film, you made a choice out front. You were shooting either black and white film or color film. But now in the current situation, in the digital world, for the most part, our cameras shoot in color. There are a couple of specialty monochrome cameras for people who want that. But for the most part, you're shooting in color, and then you're going to convert your subject to shades of gray. So we're going to talk about when to choose monochrome over color. We're going to talk about an overview of Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop and Nick Silver effects for processing black and white images. And we'll go through some specific examples. Now, I'm going to say at the outset that this is the way I do it. That doesn't mean it's the right way. It doesn't mean it's the only way, but this presentation grew out of people asking me, well, how do you get these black and white photos? So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Oops, got ahead of myself there. Okay, if you want to know more about using black and white and color than I present tonight, you can go out on the internet and there you'll find plenty of hits on when to choose black and white and when, over color and so on. But there are some fundamental things that come up in most of those discussions. And so black and white is probably better, it may be better, I don't want to say it's probably better, it may be better when light and shadows are the principal issue in a scene. I love to shoot light and shadows. For me, you don't have interesting light unless you got interesting shadows, at least much of the time. To emphasize contrast and or tonal range, we'll talk about those things, but high contrast subjects, and there are times when you go out during the day and people say you want to shoot early or late or whatever. Black and white tends to work at all hours of the day if you've got the right light and the right contrast. And it's one of the things I like about it. There's many different elements of composition, but black and white works really well when line, form, and texture are key components of the composition. And I'll show you an example of that. This is more on the artistic side. A monochrome rendering would better convey your vision. You're looking at something and you're looking at the colors and going, my, that's loud or whatever. Black and white may be the solution to that. And then kind of following right on that is when the colors distract from any of the above things. Colors are wonderful, but sometimes they hide things like lines and forms and so on, and so black and white will let you do that better. So let's talk about photographic issues and choosing black and white. For those not familiar with the medium, the one on the left is the black and white. Okay, so what I really liked about this scene, and some people, like this kind of photograph, others not, but what I really liked about this was the shadows of the bicycle and the textures on the sidewalk and the wall. Those were what I thought were critical. Over on this side, well, the wall is kind of a pale and sickly blue, and you really don't see the texture all that well. And the sidewalk kind of offsets against that. I'm not sure if that's a contrasting color or a complementary color. I won't say it's complementary because it just doesn't feel right. That combination of bluish and pink, at least for this particular scene, don't work very well. On the other side, the wall is got a lot of texture and it comes out. You got the boldness of the shadow. And this is pretty much a high contrast image. You really just have the dark blacks and then the grays. You don't really have an extreme white, but you've got enough contrast from the wall. So for me, in this picture, black and white becomes very interesting, makes this a very interesting composition. Here, not so much. And if you don't agree, I don't really need to know, No, that's, no, I always welcome feedback. Oops. I welcome pressing the right key, but that's less frequent. Okay. Photographic issues. Here's one of the things I was talking about before. This subject was very heavy on shadows and light, lots of lines and forms and shapes, and lots of, and a long tonal range as opposed to being really high contrast. I mean, there's certainly contrast in here. There's a long tonal range. That just didn't render as well in color for me. It's not bad as a color photo, but it's a lot stronger as a black and white photo by the way I see things. Now, what do I mean when I say tonal range? I suspect most of you know, but I'll go over it quickly. There's a long range. Probably your brightest area is here, and probably your darkest area is behind this column here. So black and white lends itself to a range of tones where you've got a dark, dark, and a white, white, and then a bunch of gray in between. Black and white does that very well. Again, less so on the color side. Probably some things worth saying in this image is that I shot this when there was a lot of, I got lucky, I was there when there was a lot of angled light on the wall. So you get all the texture from the paint that's, well, this building wasn't painted until recently, the unpainted cement, and you get all the little cracks and crevices, all of which add photographic interest to the picture. And I will tell you that since then, they've painted that wall and it's not as interesting as it used to be. Although it might work in color now, who knows? Okay. Black and white versus color. To me, mood is one of the things. And in this photo over here, in the black and white version, he looks more baleful, if you will, more threatening. He's got he kind of takes out that last little bit of color, and it makes him, it's a vulture, basically. These are not pretty birds. And so I wanted to pronounce the feathers and the wrinkles in the neck and, the little hairs that are popping out of his head. All of that kind of contributes to the look of being a vulture or a buzzard or whatever the alternate names are. On the right side, he doesn't look real pretty either, but he's at least, he doesn't have that same quality of, you're kind of in the black and white version right down to the fundamentals of the texture and the way his eye is looking and all of that. You just pay more attention. You're not distracted by the blue sky or the subtle shades of tan or what have you. Now, if you like the right side better, then stick with it. But by all means, but I think that to convey a mood of austerity or gloom or whatever that goes with a vulture, this happens to work better. Okay, here's a case where I think both work. Now, to be fair, most people prefer the color version if you present them side by side. But if you don't present them side by side, a lot of people like the black and white version. And I don't think it doesn't do quite as well on the screen as it does on the screen in front of me, but it's still you still get the basic. There's a lot of silver tones in this spoonbill. And I use this picture specifically because on the one on the left, the black and white, actually won in a monochrome competition, and the one on the right, I said that right, but okay, the one on the right won in a color competition. So both are possible, both work, and generally you're not going to present them side by side, so that's not an issue. But I also present this for another reason, because you wouldn't normally think that something like a roseate spoonbill would be a subject that would work in black and white. You know, I've shot butterflies and presented them in black and white, and I've had people say, oh, that's kind of surprising, but it's very good, because you tend to think of these nature subjects as color things. If you want to mess with black and white, don't worry about whether it's nature or whatever. Worry about whether that photograph works in black and white or it doesn't. Oops. All right, black and white versus color. I used to not, when I did this presentation, this is the first time I've ever shown the black and white version of this photo. It is at best insipid. You know, the colors make this one. And so there's no real reason for the black and white other than to say, you know, there's some things that don't work in black and white. That's not to say you can't do something with clouds, because I've done plenty, and you can't do things at sunset or sunrise that make sense in black and white. But in this specific case, the colors are just overwhelming. The other thing that's worth saying here is that part of the reason that this shines so much more is the contrast isn't in the tones. Here, they're kind of okay, but there's not that much contrast or not that much showing up. What you have here is what you call color contrast. The contrast between the sky and that's being hit by the sun and the sky that's not being hit by the sun, right? The sun is back there behind the horizon, and it's illuminating some of these clouds, and then some of the sky is not getting illuminated by it at this point. And so you get color contrast in addition to the contrast in the light. And then of course you got the front, which is a silhouette, and this tree, which is, by the way, no longer standing on Big Talbot Island. One of the hurricanes took it out. That was like everybody's favorite tree to shoot for sunrise for a number of years. I also have to thank Sean Trainer, who's in the room tonight, who said, you might want to hurry a bit, that light is fading, and he was right. I got 3 frames off. I got 3 frames off and managed to get this picture out of them. So light changes quickly, and that's true in black and white or color. Okay. When not to choose black and white. This is, some of this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but it happens. Don't use black and white to rescue a bad photo. That never works out. I tried it. I'm not preaching here. I'm just, you know, okay, let's see. When the voice in my head said, yeah, it's underexposed and noisy, let's try black and white. Don't do that. It's not that noise might not be a valuable thing in either a black and white or a color one, but rescue is not coming from black and white in those situations. Also, it's not going to improve a poor composition, and I don't mention it here, or a photograph that's not sharp. If it's not sharp and it's poorly or poorly composed, monochrome is not going to bail you out. And unfortunately, I've heard, some people, the first time they decide to try monochrome is when they got a bad photo. Well, that's not ever going to be a good experience. Take a photo you really like and convert it and see how that goes. Okay. So we'll talk about tools and workflow here. Lightroom is where I start. It does basic adjustments for exposure, highlights, etc. Transformation adjustments, it will do black and white, and now they've added new tools. The most recent version of Photoshop has added, Lightroom and Photoshop have added some new tools for selecting subjects so you can differentiate from the background and things like that. And as of a couple of versions ago, for a while now, they've improved things like they've had the thing called clarity, they have texture. All of those help in black and white photography. So you don't necessarily have to buy the Nik tools or some other black and white package to get good black and white. What I find by using the Nik tools is that it's faster. And a real good example, I took a picture of a waterfall in West Virginia, not the one we saw earlier, but I took a picture and I was in the motel room and I didn't have the Nik tools on my laptop. So I thought I'd see what I could do in Photoshop. And I spent a good bit of time, like 90 minutes, bringing out different parts and making the waterfall look better and all those kind of stuff. And then I got home and I tried it again with Nik and it took me 15 minutes. And the Nik one looked better to boot. So that's just my bias, but you can get a lot done with Photoshop and Lightroom. And you don't necessarily even have to venture into the world of Photoshop. I use it a bit, but Lightroom will do a lot. So if you want to try and start there, that's worthwhile. And you don't have to invest in anything to do it as long as you're already paying for your Lightroom license. Okay. DxOMark is the company that now owns Nik Silver Effect. And it's a very thorough tool set for monochrome conversions. I always start by using the presets, and they give you a fair amount of those. So there's a few that I hone in on, and then I make adjustments from there. But the presets give you a good starting point. They also provide some finishing tools. So if you want to do things like, borders and stuff like that, fancier borders, those come with Nik. My thought is that you should learn to do the basics first and then play with the finishing stuff. Photoshop is really, I don't use it as much anymore, but it is good for making local adjustments, and it does a little bit better with layers and masks. Now with the most recent version of Lightroom, masking is so good in Lightroom that I use Photoshop even less. But it is good for what we call pixel level adjustments. If you need to use the clone tool, I find that the one in Photoshop will let you do a little more refined work than in Lightroom. And it also has a black and white adjustment layer. So if you're used to using Photoshop and not Lightroom, you can do black and white conversions in Photoshop and get very much the same results. Okay, so now we'll take a look at how I work and what goes on. So I import all of my files into Lightroom, and then I kind of go through a selection process, kind of ranking and flagging the ones that I think I might want to work on, and marking the other ones that I don't want to work on to get rid of. I've decided, however, disk space is relatively cheap, so I spend more time trying to focus on what I'm going to use and not what I'm going to throw away. So if you look at this is the Photoshop. This thing is more trouble than it's worth. Over here is the panel where you get all of your Photoshop adjustments. And I've expanded that over here. And you folks out there on Zoom, forgive me for a moment. But here, this is a little bit hard to see on the screen. Here is all of the basic things that you can do in Photoshop before you do a black and white adjustment. I'm sorry, that's Lightroom. Thank you, whoever said that. But here's your basic adjustments. So I always make a set of basic adjustments. Normally, I hit auto first. And then I see what Photoshop gives me after I hit auto. And then I tweak from there. So in this case, what I want to make sure is, especially for black and white photography, right? You're only dealing with shades of gray. So I want to make sure I'm not clipping the highlights or the shadows. Except maybe very if you got like a reflection off of something metallic, well, that's always going to be burned out. But everything else, I'm trying to minimize the amount of information that I'm losing in the highlights or shadows. So you look at the histogram up here, and I can press the right button just once, and you kind of see that we're touching on both ends, but nothing is lost, right? And most of the information is in the middle. So this is a good starting place for your black and white photo. You have kind of a balanced set of tones, and you're not burning out either your blacks or burning out your whites or losing your blacks in the darkness. So then you right click on the photo and you select Edit In and click Edit in Silver Effects Pro 2. Okay, that's the Nik tool, DxOMark/Nik tool, is Silver Effects for converting to black and white. You get a pop-up window that looks just like this. You want to edit the copy that you just adjusted in Lightroom. And generally speaking, the default file copy option should be okay. Note that it's got to be, you can't use a PDF in Nik. You've got to use either a TIFF or a JPEG or one of those. It doesn't handle the Photoshop PSD option. And then you just click Edit. And now you've got the Nik Silver Effects Pro. On the right are your individual tools. Do that again. On the right are your individual tools. And so you've got things like contrast, brightness, and one called structure. Structure is the one that you don't find in Lightroom or Photoshop. In Lightroom now, they've got sliders for clarity and texture, so you can kind of emulate that. So it's come a ways in that regard. But when I first started doing it, that did not exist. Well, clarity was there, but texture wasn't. In any event, the first thing I do, at the bottom you've got your histogram, and again you can see here that you've got a lot of content in the middle, but you're not burned out, you're not losing information on the ends. So still important. And you can watch that while you're working in the Nik tools to make sure that you don't lose too much stuff on one end or the other, and make sure you're kind of got a balanced histogram for the particular subject. In addition to those basic things, you've also got selective adjustments, so you can do some area adjustments, like if you wanted to brighten, say, or darken this area, You can use the selective adjustments in Nick. They're pretty good. You just place them on the area you want to work, and then you can control that a little bit. You can control the structure and the light and the dark and the contrast and all of that stuff. So it gives you some local control within Nick. And then it's got color tools right here. They're color filters, and they work just like black and white color filters did for film. If you use a red filter, for example, you're going to darken the sky because the sky is blue, so it doesn't allow the blue tones to come through. That seems counterintuitive to some people, but that's the way it worked in the film era, and that's what they tried to emulate. If you don't like that, you can make similar adjustments in Photoshop before you come over. But if you get used to it and you know what to do with it. So yellow and red tend to be the ones that darken your skies. Green is the one that lightens foliage. And blue will make your skies white if you really want that type of thing. But it can be useful to in situations where you're trying to tone down a lot of green foliage, or you've got some strong reds that you want to bring down. It will do that. I'm going to get to that next. The left is your presets. So you've got a whole bunch of presets here that you can play with, and no harm in clicking on them. You just, click away. I will tell you my personal favorites are high structure, and they've got both a harsh and a smooth, and counterintuitively, the harsh works better for most situations. I do use the smooth. There's also a full dynamic range one that I find handy. That one sometimes causes artifacting. You get little halos around things, so you have to be careful using that one. And again, they've got a harsh and a smooth for reasons known only to them. Those are probably the ones that I most often use. But you've got all sorts of effects there. They've got some presets for like sepia tone things. If you want to play with those, you can try them. But all of them are a starting point. You want to make some adjustments to those, and you learn how to do that over time. And a very wise and good photographer that I once met said, if you want to know what a slider does, right, you've got all these sliders over here, and you want to know what structure's doing, just slide it all the way to the right and see what happens. And if you don't like it, then slide it back. And that's it. You've got to go into this thing, especially when you're first learning it, you got to go into it with experimentation. So try the presets and then try tweaking them. Your first experience you may get a good photograph out of it, but most likely what you're going to get is learning. And over time, you figure out a little bit more. Oh, yeah, that would be difficult to read. But I don't know that they would come across on the other two. High structure is one of them. High structure, full dynamic range, and what's that? Harsh, yeah, full, yeah. And both of those use the harsh. I mean, they have harsh and a smooth. I would try both. But I find that the harsh seems to work better for most cases, especially if you're trying to bring out texture in clouds and things like that. That was the thing that was Nick's big contribution, I think, to the process over, say, Lightroom or Photoshop. Oh, sure. Let's see if I can pick an area. Right up here, you've got very little detail, and you've got just a little bit of It's almost white, but it's not completely white. You got a little bit of texture and tone there, but not. Clipping is if you push the exposure so far to the right that went blank white. Does that make sense to who asked the question? Yes. Okay. And it's the same thing on the other end. You've got, maybe hard to see here, but you've got just a little bit of detail that surrounds these things. If you if you make them too dark, you drag the exposure too far to the left, then you may lose some detail there. So that's what I mean. And when that happens, right here at the ends of the histogram, you'll see these little spikes show up. And they kind of, if you think of this as a wall, the spikes kind of run up the wall. Then you're clipping some information. And yeah, and the last thing I would say is there's a little box that you can click on the histogram, and it will actually show you in the picture area what's being clipped. Okay, so if you click on the right, you get the burned out highlights and you'll actually see them. And if you click on the left, you'll get the blacked out shadows and you'll actually see them. And then last but not least, and probably should go without saying, once you've done all these lovely adjustments, you want to save your work. So you hit the button that says save on the right. It seemed obvious, but you know, if you've ever hit cancel accidentally and then managed to say yes when they tell you, do you really want to cancel?
So when you say the original and say yes to make a copy, or
okay, so when you're working on a raw photograph in Photoshop, or actually any photograph in Photoshop, it's actually not changing the original. So you've got that original, and then you've got all the adjustments applied to this. So that's still in Photoshop. When this is saved, it goes back as a copy. And then you have the choice of, you can do more with that back in Photoshop. So in this particular case, I selected the high structure harsh. I didn't really modify it. And as it turned out, for this particular photo, this worked. Okay. So then we click the save button, as I said. So now I get back to Lightroom, and what I tend to do here is I come back in and I hit auto once again, just to see what Lightroom wants to do with this. And in this case, it worked. That almost never happens, where I just hit auto and it's everything I want it to be. But what I'm wanting to do here is, because I didn't have those highlights and things touching the edges, I want to make sure that I've got it a full range of white to dark without clipping. So you see up here in Lightroom, it's showing me that there's nothing running up the walls, but I've got just the lights turned on. So that means I've got a complete white, a complete black, and a whole bunch of tones in between, represented by the histogram. Histograms could be a whole separate lesson, so I'm not going to go deeply into that, but if they are worth knowing about for both black and white and color photography if you're relatively new to this. So then I pushed the sliders maybe a little bit. I didn't have to in this case, but you see that blacks went to -5 and whites went to like 27. And so that gave me that just ensured that I got a full range of tones, and I was done. Okay, and so now we've got all the things I talked about. We've got the full range of tones, the emphasis on all the shapes and the lines and how all this stuff is working together. By the way, when I first looked at this after I got it done, I thought, oh, I don't know that I could enter this in competition because there's no strong center of interest. So I asked somebody who does some judging, and they said, enter it, it'll work. But, you know, because it's really the whole thing. There's not one area of this that's profoundly more important than the others. It's a complex whole. And so here's the before and after. And you can judge the difference for yourself, but for me, it's a no contest. Question? Okay. All right. Now we're going to talk about Lightroom, Photoshop, and Nik and how they work together. This is not the normal garden variety vulture. This is actually an African vulture I shot at the alligator farm. He's got that warm and welcoming look to him that, you know, you'd you'd like to sit down for a cup of coffee with the guy. Interestingly, the color on this one is really almost already monochromatic. So the decision to make it a true monochromatic photograph was easy for me. Texture to me is the key issue here. I mean, other than the look of the subject himself and his warm smile, you've got a great deal of texture that's up here in the hair and in the feathers and along the neck and so on. And you have a decent tonal range. But he was somewhat backlit, as you can see from the feathers here. There's still detail there, but it was kind of a backlit situation. And then, of course, you got all sorts of texture around the eye. Again, the whites and the blacks are not clipped. I moved the highlight slider down to 100 to bring down the brightness in the background and also to make sure that I got the hair as much definition up around the dome here where the backlight was, and also in this area. I moved the shadows to plus 100 to bring out the detail in the buzzard. Right, on the original, you really could not, this was just a bit too dark, especially in the neck area and the face area. So moving that shadow slider up, I maxed it out and it worked. So we got better detail in. And then I right-clicked on the image to do this in Photoshop. Now, why am I going to Photoshop and why didn't I go on the last one? Well, the last one, I didn't have a lot of local adjustments to make. Once I had the balance, I didn't need to do too much that was local to that photo. Whatever I needed to do, I could do in Lightroom, but really it didn't require it. On this one, I knew I was going to have to make some local adjustments, and we'll talk about what in a moment. But the thing about this is, and the reason for using Photoshop with Nik is now Nik will be a separate layer. If you don't work with layers in Photoshop, it is not anywhere near as daunting as it sounds. You can learn layers very quickly, and there's plenty of good guidance out on the web. And then there are probably, there are people who give classes and so on, but we'll see how that looks in a moment for this example. So you click the filter item on the Photoshop main menu, and then you click filter, you click Nik collection, and then you click Silver Effects Pro Tool, and the photo will open in the Nik tool, just like you saw before. So we find ourselves in the back once again. We'll try that again. Okay. So here's an example using my favorite preset, again, high structure harsh. So this is what the neutral conversion looks like. Darn. This is the neutral conversion over here, and it just simply takes that and converts it to shades of gray, but it doesn't do much to enhance the buzzardness of this thing. That's a word in the dictionary, by the way, in case you were wondering. So I clicked high structure harsh, and now you get all the detail coming out in the bird. And that's what that slider does. It is good for detail. But notice that in the background, it's also brought out this rather smooth background has now got a lot more stuff that's visible. It's not overwhelming, but it's not all that desirable either. So we save it and go back to Photoshop. And now this is added as a new layer. So there's the original color one that I brought in, and here's a layer. Here's a layer for the Nick tool that we just did. Okay. So what we do is we add a mask. You alt-click the layer mask icon, this little, I've got it circled, but for those who right there, that's where you add a layer mask. And all the mask does is allow you to selectively paint on that layer so that you can hide things or reveal things. That's it. It's really fairly simple. You know, because when I first did Photoshop and people talked to me about layers, my eyes would cross and my mind would go blank. That really wasn't necessary. It's much simpler than it seems. So you create the layer mask, which is this black thing here, and it gets selected immediately. And then what I did was just simply brush out the parts in black and white that I didn't want. So now, and this is very convenient when you're working in black and white, because if you look at this, you now see it has this two-tone look. So what I did was just paint in his face and his neck and stuff like that, and all this other stuff that I didn't want to emphasize, I just left blank, so it went back to its original state. But now I don't have a black and white photograph, I've got one that's two-tone. So from here, you got two choices. You either can use an adjustment layer that's a black and white layer in Photoshop and make another layer, or you can come back to Lightroom and just do a black and white conversion there. So here's the final in PS. I decided to go back to Lightroom and do it. You can see I've painted in all the good stuff here. So here was partially painted, here's fully painted, and now the background is still nice and smooth, although it's in color. I also laid off on painting some of the beak because I didn't want to bring out too much of that. It was, it was a little bit marked and stuff. So I wanted to, I didn't want to hamper a good looking guy like this with a, Okay, so now I come back to here, and then I just click the black and white button. Right up here, there's, right there. Instead, you have a thing that says treatment, it's either color or black and white. You just go to black and white, and bingo, it completes the process for you. So now you've got the buzzard with all the detail you want, but your background is basically still smooth. I do that very, very frequently in my black and white photos. I would have to almost say more often than not, probably more than 50% of the time. That's a trick I use to emphasize certain areas of the photograph and not emphasize certain other ones. And by the way, it's not illegal for competitions. It's just a form of selective sharpening, because that's basically what structure is. So you're doing selective sharpening on the important part of the bird, and you're leaving the background more blurry. Better bokeh for those of you who are connoisseurs of bokeh. Now, you can also add split toning. You can also add sepia toning, which I did in Photoshop. You can do that in Nick. I don't tend to. I prefer to come back and do it here after I've got a final result that I like. This is now changed in the current version of Photoshop, so it's a couple of circular dials. I'll have to update that slide at some point. But the bottom line is I didn't do anything real fancy. I used the same tone for both light and shadows, highlights and shadows, and about the same amount of the same hue and almost the same amount of saturation. And so now the sepia tone kind of conveys it the way it originally was, except the last little bits of contrasting color and things that didn't look like they belonged there are gone. And I thought that worked well for a natural subject. But some people just prefer the straight monochrome version. And so here's your before and after. I think you've got a lot better visibility of the detail of the bird. That really, I think, works for this particular subject. I'm always encouraged when people still applaud at the end. You know, they start at the beginning. I think, okay, that's the last time anybody's going to applaud tonight. But questions, seriously? Yes.
So when you took that picture, did you from the get-go decide it was going to be black?
That's a very good question.
You decided that before you even.
That's an excellent question, because there's people who say, you know, you should know up front it's going to be black and white. Sure. Yeah, the question was, did I know that I was going to make those things black and white at the time that I took them? And the answer is no. Sometimes I'll look at something and go, okay, yeah, this is black and white. Like the one of the church, I was pretty sure I was going to convert to black and white. But the one of the buzzard, no, I didn't really think of that in advance. I just sometimes will look at a photograph and think, okay, let's give this a shot. And more often than not, when I do that, that tends to work now. So as you get more experience doing it, it gets better. The other thing I was going to say, like the one of the roseate, I took the color version and I had it for a couple of years. And one day as I was flipping through some older photographs, I went, you know, that might work in black and white. And then I did the black and white version and got a lot of positive feedback and also won a ribbon for it. So no, I don't always know that it's going to be, whoa. By the way, yeah, this is high contrast black and white. So yeah, there we go. Thank you. Yes.
Do you ever use like Google presets or no?
I haven't used their presets much. I played with them once or twice. I prefer because I'm so used to using Nick. It's certainly worth a shot, and especially if you just want to play with black and white and before you invest in anything else, you may find that everything you want to do in black and white is right there in Lightroom. So there's presets there, and certainly as the tools have gotten better, it's made it's leveled the playing field a little bit. For me, I still find it to be more efficient. Silas.
The app for Nick, can you show me the app for Nick? Can you download it on my phone? You have the app up there?
You can't do Nick on your phone, I'm sorry. It won't work there. So, Linda.
When do you sharpen?
When do I sharpen? That's an excellent question. It used to be that I used the default Photoshop sharpening at the beginning, like when I came in, and then I really did, because I was using Nick structure, that kind of provides a sharpening aspect to it. So I didn't tend to do much else, but then I would do some output sharpening. I would because when you change the size of something, you generally tend to lose a little sharpness. So then I would do Photoshop's standard output sharpening, generally a low amount or what have you. I try not to over sharpen. Now that I'm using the Topaz AI tools, I've stopped using the default sharpening for either color or black and white. I've stopped using the Lightroom one, and when I take it over into Photoshop, the first thing I do is go out to AI noise control and do some basic sharpening and noise reduction out there, because it just does so much a better job, in my opinion. It's not perfect, mind you, I have to tweak it some of the time, but it just is a better tool as far as I can tell. Roxanne?
Is the Nix software on subscription now, or are you purchasing it?
It is, yeah, it is subscription. It was free while it was in Google's hands. But you can get it from DxOMark, and it's a whole suite. You get, I tend to use, there's two, Color Effects Pro and Silver Effects Pro. I use the Color Effects Pro for the color photographs. Probably not as much as I used to at one point, because again, the tools have gotten better in Lightroom, but I still do use that. And then I use the Nix Silver Effects, because in black and white. And once in a while, I will tell you another trick that's not in the handout here, so you get a bonus for having showed up. You can use the Nix Silver Effects and do all sorts of interesting things there, and then come back and in Photoshop, tell it that that layer is I would have to forget this at the moment, the very last in the slider. Sean, do you remember what that is? Luminosity. Luminosity, thank you. If I had prizes, you would get one for that. You do it as a luminosity layer, so then you get all of the interesting effects, but you don't convert it to black and white. And I have done that. What's that? Yeah. When you can go into Nix Silver Effects and do all the structure stuff and all of that kind of cool stuff, and then come back to Photoshop, and you got to do this in Photoshop and apply that as a luminosity layer. And that way you still get color, but you get all these other effects. And so you can significantly, like if you use the color filters and you darken the grass, for example, then when you come back, it'll do that, but now you've got a darker green grass, for example. You can do some of that with color effects, but I often will do that trick with Silver Effects, and it gives you a different look. And you have to decide whether you like that look for that photograph. But it's often worth doing. Rebecca?
I don't know if this is for you or maybe for Leslie, but you mentioned the AI, we spoke past.
Yeah.
Competitions where it says no AI, is that what they mean?
No, we in fact, we had this discussion. We're cobbling this together, but no, that's not what's meant. It's really the AI it's the AI that generates images. Like Photoshop has a new tool that will generate pieces of your image for you. And out on the web, there's a ton of these little, I won't say there's a ton of them, but there's now several AI generators where you can say, okay, I want a guy in a raincoat standing in the middle of a storm, and it will create an image. We definitely don't want that in the competition. And so some of the other stuff is some subject to still some discussion, and they're hammering that out. But the sharpening tools and stuff like that, no, that's not the intent. And that's not the intent from the F3C rules where we first got this. Other questions? Yes.
As a style choice, do you like dark styles or light styles?
Both, but usually dark. So, and I don't have any examples here, but yeah, I do like the, although with some of these storm clouds where you've got several layers, I kind of like full range, but I generally go for the dark end. And for blue skies, I tend to darken them a little bit. Other questions? Or everybody's just going, let me up, I've had enough. Okay, thank you again. You've been wonderful.
Once again, a fabulous presentation.
One of those again.
All right. So before we talk about the winners from the People's Choice, I want to thank George and Debbie for being here and doing all the work on the fences. And so the winners were, third place is Stephen Block, and come up, who's gonna have a photo with all three of the winners of the People's Choice. Stephen Block is, oh, okay, that one. Second place is Marianne Huddleston. Okay, that's under the pier. And the first place is Ted Floor. Another pier shot. Come on up. All right, thank you all for joining us this evening, and I'll see a bunch of you over at Collane's. I'm sorry? Okay, oh. So, we're done tonight. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll see a bunch of you at Collane's. Thank you. Actually went pretty well.